Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today is the Dating Game Killer Part 4. This is the story of Rodney Alcala. Now, when we last left off, we were talking about his appearance on a show that he would be infamous for. But before we do that, we're going to go back and recap on a couple things. If you remember, he would be extradited in 1971 after fleeing California for the assault on Tali Shapiro. And after 3 years, they would extradite him and bring him in for trial. And at the time, the cops thought it was an open shut case. They were going to try him for the kidnapping, the assault, and attempted murder on Tali Shapiro. But even though Tali had done a full recovery, her parents did not want her to be around any of the events that transpired on that day. So the police lost their material witness, and the only thing they could try Alcala for was child molestation, which they would only give him 3 years for. And not only would they only give him 3 years for, he would only serve 17 months of that sentence. He would actually be paroled in 1974, and within a few months of being paroled, he would again assault a 13-year-old girl who the courts go under the alias of Julie J. And he would be arrested and sentenced again and would not be released until 1977. And upon his parole and being released in 1977, he had went to his parole officer and asked if he could have permission to go to New York. And even though of his current charges, even though he was a flight risk, and even though he was a repeat offender, the parole officer actually granted this. This is something that I completely think is crazy to this day. And we had talked about Ellen Hoover, who was the daughter of Herman Hoover, who was a very famous nightclub owner. She was also the goddaughter of not only Dean Martin, but Sammy Davis Jr. This kind of gives you an idea of the social acolytes she hung around with. And she would go missing on July 15th, 1977. So when she was reported missing, the police would go into her apartment, they would do a full investigation, and they would find in her diary and in her calendar that she had an appointment with a photographer named John Berger. When they did further investigation, they had found out that Rodney Alcala not only went under the alias in New York as John Berger, but he would also go under the alias John Berger in New Hampshire. So they would call Alcala in, who was living in New York at the time. They would bring him in. They would ask him, did you have any whereabouts or know any whereabouts of Ellen Hoover? And he didn't deny it. He said, I had an appointment with her. We were going to do some photo shoots, and we did it right behind the Rockefeller estate. And an aspiring model actually confirmed this, that they would actually on that day do photos behind the estate. But because there was no evidence of foul play, there was no body, they took him at base value and they let him go. They would not find out later that she had been murdered 11 months later and was found underneath some heavy rocks that was overlooking the Hudson River right behind the Rockefeller estate. And on November 9th, 1977, another New York resident would actually be found in California. Jill Barcombe would be found in Mulholland Drive, and the way her body had been positioned and how she had been treated, people literally thought it was one of the Hillside Stranglers. She had been strangled with a shoelace, her body had been positioned, and they could also tell that her head was bashed in. Well, upon the capture of the Hillside Stranglers, police would actually ask them, did you have anything to do with Jill Barcombe? Nothing connected them. They did not confess to it, and they found out that they did not do it. And she would not have justice until later events were done, when a DNA tests were tested and found out Alcala had murdered her. And on December 16th, 1977, nurse Georgia Waxted would actually go missing. She was a nurse, and she regularly took her friend to the hospital where they worked at. And when she didn't return for work the next day, her friends would call the authorities and report her missing. The police would go to her apartment. Again, they would find signs of forced entry. And when they walked in, they would find Miss Wicks on the floor of her bedroom. She had been strangled with her nylons, her face had been bashed in, and her genitals had been mutilated. And after the murder, she had been posed as these many times before, even having the same signature bite marks on her right and left breasts that other victims had had. They would later find handprints in the bedroom, but would not be able to pinpoint who it was until DNA testing was further done down the road and convict Alcala of this murder. Which brings us to his appearance on The Dating Game that would come out in October of 1978. And as I said before, it was a game where people would go on the show, a bachelorette would be on one side, the bachelors would be on the other. And the bachelorette would ask a series of questions to which each bachelor would answer. Now, looking back at it now, there's a lot of signs that people should have had red flags going off. But because no one knew Alcala was a serial killer, no one paid much attention. But looking back at it, his answers are more haunting. In the video I played in the last episode, she would go and ask Alcala what's his favorite time of the day, to which he would say nighttime. And she would ask, what about day and evening? And he would say, they're all right, but nighttime's when it gets really fun. No one would have known it then, but he's more or less suggesting about how his actions and his attacks on women and children were more fun at night. There was another question where she asked Alcala, if I were to serve you as dinner, what would you be? And Alcala would snicker and say, call me a banana, because I'm big. And she would say, can you be more descriptive? To which he would say, peel me. Which, looking back at it now, it is a very, very creepy statement. Cheryl Bradshaw would inevitably choose Alcala as the winner of the show. And he would finally walk around, he would get to meet Cheryl Bradshaw, shake her hand, and they would walk backstage. Not just Cheryl Bradshaw, but even the male contestants on the show would go and later testify and say that once they got to speak with him, there was just something about him that was just really creepy. In fact, Cheryl Bradshaw would actually call the producers the next following day and would ask them, is it okay if I cancel my date with this gentleman? And they said, it's perfectly fine. Criminal profiler Pat Brown would later say that this rejection would be the reason for Alcala's murder spree that would happen right after the show. And on June 24th, 1978, Charlotte Lamb, a 31-year-old secretary, would be found dead in the laundry room of her apartment in Santa Monica. It was the same MO as the other people before. She had been strangled with a shoelace, her face had been bashed in, her genitals had been mutilated, and she again had been posed in a particular pose, exposing her breast, and there was again multiple bite marks on her either right or left breast. And on February 14th, 1979, Alcala would actually pick up hitchhiker 15-year-old Monique Hoyt. He would then drive Hoyt over to his apartment where he would grape her. And after he would grape her, he would put her in his car again and drive over to another secluded area where he would take pictures of her in her underwear. After taking pictures of her in her underwear, he would again take photos of him graping her again. He would then bind and gag her where he would continuously perform grape and sodomy on Miss Hoyt. He would then take a big rock and begin bashing her head in and put her in the car. And after he had done this, he would drive over to a gas station where Hoyt, luckily who was not dead, actually escaped from the capture and would report it to the police. Alcala would be arrested and his mother would post his bail.